The capture. The acrid smell of burning fuel filled Sergeant Jake Hawkins' nostrils as he regained consciousness. His head throbbed, and a warm trickle of blood ran down his face. Blinking away the haze, he tried to make sense of his surroundings. The last thing he remembered was piloting his ship through an uncharted sector of space, responding to a distress signal. Now, he found himself lying face down on a cold, metallic floor. The air felt different, thinner, with an alien quality that made his lungs work harder. As his vision cleared, Jake realized he wasn't alone. Towering figures moved around him, their bodies a mass of writhing tentacles and gleaming carapaces. Panic surged through him as he attempted to push himself up, only to find his limbs wouldn't respond. A paralyzing agent, he guessed, likely administered while he was unconscious. One of the aliens noticed his movement and approached, its multifaceted eyes studying him with unnerving intensity. The specimen is awake. It clicked in a language Jake shouldn't have understood, but somehow did. Prepare for transfer. Jake wanted to shout, to demand answers, but his voice failed him. He could only watch helplessly as the aliens efficiently stripped him of his flight suit and gear, leaving him in nothing but a thin, gray bodysuit. They lifted him onto a hovering platform, securing him with energy restraints that hummed with an otherworldly power. As they moved him through winding corridors of what he assumed was their ship, Jake's military training kicked in. He forced himself to stay calm, to observe and gather information. The aliens, which he mentally dubbed cephalons, due to their squid-like appearance, seemed to be a highly advanced species. Their technology was like nothing he'd ever seen, seamlessly blending organic and mechanical components. The journey ended in a vast chamber filled with transparent enclosures. To Jake's horror, each contained a different alien creature, some familiar from Earth's databases, others completely unknown. It was then that the terrible truth dawned on him. This wasn't a ship. It was a zoo. Place the human in Enclosure 17, ordered a cephalon wearing an ornate headpiece. Ensure the atmospheric controls are calibrated to its needs. We don't want our new star attraction expiring prematurely. Jake felt a surge of rage as he was unceremoniously deposited into a large, circular habitat. The energy restraints disappeared, and he immediately scrambled to his feet, charging at the invisible barrier that separated him from his captors. He slammed his fists against it, but it was like hitting a wall of solid air. The cephalons watched his display with a mixture of fascination and amusement. Remarkable, one of them chittered. Such aggression, even in captivity. The rumors about humans were true. Indeed, agreed the leader. This specimen will draw crowds from across the galaxy. Prepare the announcement. Behold the human monster, Earth's apex predator. As the aliens dispersed, Jake was left alone in his new prison. The habitat was a crude approximation of an Earth environment, with synthetic grass, a few trees, and a small shelter. A stream of recycled water trickled through the center, feeding into a pond. It was a comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless. Days blended into weeks as Jake adjusted to his new reality. He was fed a nutrient paste that tasted like cardboard, but kept him alive. Occasionally, the cephalons would introduce objects into his enclosure, simple tools or puzzles, and observe his reactions. Jake quickly realized that every moment of his existence was being studied and recorded. The worst part was the constant parade of alien visitors. They would gather around his enclosure, pointing and chattering in a cacophony of languages. Some looked at him with fear, others with disgust, and a few with something approaching admiration. To them, he was nothing more than an exotic animal, a curiosity to gawk at. Jake's initial rage gave way to a deep, simmering anger. He refused to give his captors the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, he channeled his emotions into planning. He exercised relentlessly, keeping his body in peak condition. He studied the zoo's routines, noting the patterns of the guards and the weaknesses in their security. One day, as he was going through his usual workout routine, Jake noticed something unusual. A young cephalon, smaller than the others, was watching him intently. Unlike the other visitors, this one's eyes held no fear or revulsion, only curiosity. As Jake approached the barrier, the young alien didn't retreat. Instead, it raised a tentacle and made a series of complex gestures. Jake tilted his head, unsure of how to respond. The alien repeated the motion, then pointed to itself and made a sound that Jake interpreted as a name. Zix. For the first time since his capture, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. He pointed to himself and said clearly, "Jake." Zix's eyes widened, and it quickly glanced around to ensure no one was watching. It then produced the small device and held it up to the barrier. A moment later, Jake heard a voice in his mind. "You can understand me." Jake nodded, careful not to show too much reaction. "Yes." He thought back, hoping the device would translate his thoughts. "Fascinating," Zix replied. "I've been studying your species. You're not the monster they claim you to be, are you?" "No," Jake answered. "We're not monsters. We're just different. Why are you talking to me?" Zix's tentacles rippled in what Jake guessed was agitation. "Because what they're doing is wrong. Keeping sentient beings captive like this, it goes against everything I believe in. I want to help you, Jake." Before Jake could respond, an alarm blared through the zoo. Zix quickly hid the translation device and scurried away, blending in with the crowd of startled visitors being ushered out of the area. As the enclosure's lights dimmed for the night cycle, Jake lay on his cot, his mind racing. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel something he'd almost forgotten: hope. He didn't know if he could trust Zix, but it was the first real chance he'd had at escaping this alien nightmare. As he drifted off to sleep, Jake made a silent vow. He would find a way out of this zoo, not just for himself, but for all the captive beings held against their will. And when he did, the galaxy would learn that humans were indeed dangerous, not as mindless monsters, but as a force for justice in a universe that sorely needed it. Little did Jake know that his actions in the coming days would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of galactic society and forever change the relationship between humans and alien species across the cosmos. Life in the zoo. Days blurred into weeks as Jake settled into a grim routine in his alien prison. Each morning began with the artificial sun rising in his enclosure, casting an eerie glow over the fabricated landscape. He'd awaken to the distant sounds of other exhibits coming to life, a cacophony of alien calls and mechanical whirs that never failed to remind him of his bizarre predicament. Jake's military training became his lifeline. He adhered to a strict regimen of physical exercise, using whatever he could find in his habitat. Rocks became weights, trees served as pull-up bars, and the synthetic grass provided a running track. The cephalon zookeepers watched his routines with fascination, their multifaceted eyes gleaming with a mixture of curiosity and something darker, a hunger for understanding that made Jake's skin crawl. As time passed, Jake noticed changes in his body. The constant exposure to the alien atmosphere and diet seemed to be affecting him in subtle ways. His muscles felt denser, his reflexes sharper. Whether this was an adaptation or something more sinister, he couldn't be sure. The endless parade of alien visitors continued, their reactions to Jake ranging from terror to awe. He learned to tune out their incessant chatter, focusing instead on studying them. Each species that came to gawk at the human monster provided valuable intel. Their physical capabilities, social structures, and technological advancements, all carefully filed away in Jake's mind. One particular group caught Jake's attention, a delegation of tall, willowy beings with iridescent skin. They regarded him not with fear or disgust, but with what seemed like respect. Jake overheard snippets of their conversation, translated through the zoo's omnipresent speakers. The humans' homeworld, Earth, they call it, is a death world by our standards, one of them said. Their very biology is shaped by constant struggle and adaptation. Fascinating, another replied. No wonder they've advanced so quickly. They're forged in the crucible of their own world. This conversation sparked something in Jake. He realized that his captivity might serve a greater purpose. If he could demonstrate humanity's resilience and ingenuity, perhaps he could change perceptions across the galaxy. With this in mind, he began to put on shows for his visitors. Jake started crafting simple tools from the materials in his enclosure: a spear from a sharpened branch, a crude shelter from leaves and vines. He demonstrated complex problem-solving skills, creating elaborate traps for the small robotic prey the zookeepers occasionally released into his habitat. The aliens watched in awe as he not only survived but thrived in his artificial environment. As Jake's reputation grew, so did the crowds. Aliens from across the galaxy flocked to see the legendary human monster. But with increased attention came increased scrutiny. The Cephalon scientists intensified their tests, subjecting Jake to ever more challenging scenarios. One day, they flooded his enclosure, turning it into a water world overnight. Jake treaded water for hours, his military survival training kicking in. He fashioned a crude raft from floating debris, impressing his captors with his adaptability. Another time, they simulated extreme heat, turning his habitat into a scorching desert. Jake dug into the ground, creating a cool shelter and finding hidden water sources. Through it all, Jake never forgot his true purpose: escape. He used each challenge as an opportunity to test the limits of his enclosure, probing for weaknesses in the energy barriers and studying the patterns of his captors. Zix, the young cephalon who had first communicated with Jake, became a regular visitor. Under the guise of studying the human, Zix would often stand near the barrier, surreptitiously activating the translation device. "Your displays of ingenuity have caused quite a stir," Zix communicated one day. "Some are beginning to question whether keeping you here is ethical." Jake suppressed a smile, careful not to give away their secret communication. Any progress on finding a way out? He fought back. Zix's tentacles rippled in what Jake had come to recognize as frustration. "The security systems are incredibly complex, but I'm not giving up. There's a growing movement among my people questioning the morality of zoos like this. Your presence here has become a catalyst for change." This news gave Jake renewed hope. He redoubled his efforts to showcase humanity's best qualities, demonstrating not just physical prowess, but also creativity and compassion. When a small bird-like creature somehow found its way into his enclosure, injured and afraid, Jake gently nursed it back to health. The aliens watched in amazement as the fearsome monster showed such tenderness. But not everyone was impressed by Jake's displays. A faction of hardline cephalons, led by the zoo's chief scientist, Dr. Xanax, viewed humans as a potential threat to galactic stability. The human's abilities only prove how dangerous its species could be if left unchecked. Dr. Xanax argued in a meeting Jake managed to overhear. "We must study it further, unlock the secrets of its adaptability. Imagine if we could harness that power for ourselves." These ominous words sent a chill down Jake's spine. He realized that his time might be running out. If the hardliners had their way, he could face a fate far worse than being the zoo exhibit. As if to confirm his fears, the tests intensified. The cephalons began introducing dangerous predators into his enclosure, alien beasts with razor-sharp claws and venomous bites. Jake fought for his life, using every ounce of his training and ingenuity to survive. The crowds watched in horror and excitement as he battled creatures from the nightmares of 1,000 worlds. After a particularly harrowing encounter with a 6-legged monstrosity that seemed to be made of living shadow, Jake lay exhausted in his shelter. His body was battered, his gray bodysuit torn and stained. But as he caught his breath, a steely resolve formed in his heart. He would not be a puppet for their amusement any longer. He would not allow them to twist his displays of human resilience into weapons. The time for playing along was over. The time for action had come. As the artificial night fell over his enclosure, Jake began to plan. He would show these aliens what a human was truly capable of. not as a monster, not as an exhibit, but as a free being fighting for his rights and the rights of all sentient creatures. Little did the cephalans know, their prized human specimen was about to give them a demonstration of humanity's greatest trait, the unquenchable thirst for freedom. And the galaxy would never be the same. The escape plan. As the artificial dawn broke over his enclosure, Jake Hawkins arose with a newfound determination burning in his eyes. Today would be different. Today, he would set in motion a plan that would either win him his freedom or end in spectacular failure. Jake began his usual morning routine, careful not to arouse suspicion. He went through his exercises, his movements deliberately slower and more labored than usual. To any observer, it would appear that the relentless tests and battles had finally taken their toll on the human specimen. As expected, this change in behavior drew the attention of Dr. Xanax and his team. Jake could sense their eyes on him, studying every move, every faltered step. He suppressed a smirk, knowing that his act was the first step in turning the aliens' curiosity against them. Midday brought the usual crowd of gawking visitors. Among them, Jake spotted Zix, the young cephalan who had become his secret ally. Their eyes met briefly, and Jake gave an almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Suddenly, Jake collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing in apparent agony. The crowd gasped, tentacles and appendages flailing in shock. Alarms blared throughout the facility as Dr. Xanax and his team rushed to the enclosure. The specimen is experiencing severe distress, Dr. Xanax announced, his tentacles twitching with a mixture of concern and excitement. We must intervene immediately. The energy barrier flickered and fell. A team of cephalan scientists entered, approaching Jake's prone form cautiously. As they drew near, Jake's eyes snapped open. In a blur of motion, he sprang to his feet, catching the aliens off guard. Jake moved with a speed and precision that belied his earlier display of weakness. He ducked under grasping tentacles, using the cephalan's bulk against them. In seconds, he had incapacitated the science team and was sprinting towards the open doorway. Alarms screamed throughout the zoo as Jake raced down sterile corridors, his bare feet slapping against the metallic floor. He had memorized the layout during his months of captivity, each overheard conversation, and glimpsed datapad helping to form a mental map of the facility. As he rounded a corner, he nearly collided with Zix. The young cephalan's eyes widened in surprise and fear. "Jake, what are you doing?" Zix's thoughts rang in Jake's mind, the translation device working overtime. "What we discussed," Jake replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm making a stand for all of us. Are you with me?" Zix hesitated for a moment, tentacles writhing in indecision. Then, with a determined set to its posture, it nodded. "I'll help you, but we need to move quickly. They'll be locking down the facility." Together, human and cephalan raced through the zoo, Zix using its access codes to open doors and bypass security measures. As they ran, Jake's true plan unfolded. They weren't just escaping, they were liberating. At each enclosure they passed, Jake and Zix deactivated the energy barriers, freeing the captive beings within. A stampede of alien creatures followed in their wake, a menagerie of the galaxy's most exotic and dangerous species now running free. The zoo descended into chaos. Alarms blared, lights flashed, and the panicked shouts of cephalan staff echoed through the corridors. In the control room, Dr. Xanax watched in horror as his life's work crumbled before his eyes. "Stop them," he shrieked, his usual composure shattered. "Contain the specimens at all costs." But it was too late. The liberated creatures, guided by Jake and Zix, overwhelmed the zoo's security forces. Species that had been mortal enemies in the wild now worked together, united by their shared desire for freedom. As they approached the zoo's main entrance, Jake and Zix found their path blocked by a phalanx of heavily armed cephalan guards. For a moment, it seemed their journey would end here, mere steps from freedom. Then the ground shook. The guards turned, their weapons wavering, as a massive shape lumbered into view. It was the shadow beast Jake had fought earlier, its amorphous body rippling with barely contained power. But instead of attacking, it positioned itself between the escapees and the guards. One by one, other creatures joined it. The bird-like alien Jake had nursed back to health, perched on the shadow beast's back. A group of sentient crystalline beings that refracted the harsh lights into dazzling patterns. Even a swarm of microscopic organisms that clouded the air like a living mist. Jake stepped forward, standing tall among this coalition of improbable allies. "Your zoo is finished," he declared, Zix translating his words for all to hear. These beings are not specimens to be caged and gawked at. They are living, thinking creatures who deserve freedom and respect. The guards lowered their weapons, overwhelmed by the sight before them and the power of Jake's words. In that moment, it became clear that something momentous had occurred, a shift in the very fabric of galactic society. As the zoo's main doors slid open, bathing the escapees in the light of an alien sun, Jake turned to Zix. "What now?" he asked, the enormity of their actions finally sinking in. Zix's eyes crinkled in what Jake had come to recognize as a smile. "Now," it replied, "we show the galaxy what true coexistence looks like." Together, the unlikely band of former captives took their first steps into a new world and a new era for all sentient beings. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of the great zoo liberation spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Jake Hawkins, once exhibited as a fearsome human monster, became a symbol of freedom and justice. The Cephalon government, facing widespread protests and diplomatic pressure, was forced to outlaw the practice of keeping sentient beings in zoos. Zix, hailed as a hero among its own people, became a leading voice in the movement for interspecies understanding and cooperation. The liberated creatures, rather than dispersing, chose to stay together, forming a unique community that became a model of peaceful coexistence. As for Jake, he found himself in the unprecedented position of being humanity's first official ambassador to the galactic community. His experiences, both harrowing and inspiring, helped pave the way for Earth's entry onto the cosmic stage. Standing on the balcony of the newly established Galactic Council chambers, Jake looked out at the myriad alien species mingling below. He couldn't help but smile as he spotted the shadow beast giving rides to excited alien children, its once terrifying form now a source of joy. "Quite a change from the zoo, isn't it?" Zix said, gliding up beside him. Jake nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. "We've come a long way, but we got so much further to go." As they stood there, human and cephalon side by side, both knew that the true adventure was just beginning. The stars stretched out before them, infinite in their promise, waiting to be explored not as monsters or specimens, but as equals in the grand tapestry of cosmic life. The end of Jake's captivity had marked the beginning of a new chapter for all sentient beings, and as the galaxy watched and wondered, the legacy of the human who was once a zoo exhibit continued to shape the destiny of countless worlds.